Hello there, and welcome to Minnesota Homeownership Center's Welcome Home podcast. My name is Bill Gray, and today we're checking in with two folks leading the charge at the Minnesota Capitol on behalf of homeownership this legislative session. Joining me are Julie Gugin, president of the Homeownership Center, and my boss. Welcome back, Julie.
Thanks, Bill.
And Jeff Washburne, lead organizer with the statewide Homeownership Minnesota, or Home Coalition. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks to both of you for coming on the show. Okay, let's start with the center, Julie. Once again, I know we're partnering with Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity on a joint legislative agenda around homeownership issues. And we're coming off a game-changing session last year where our two organizations teamed up with the Minnesota Realtors to secure $150 million in first-generation homebuyers down payment assistance. More on that in a later episode. But Julie, how do we top last year's performance? What are we chasing this year?
Yeah, last year's results were outstanding and unprecedented, not just for the Homeownership Center and Habitat's agenda, but for affordable housing overall, particularly affordable ownership. Jeff will talk a little bit more about this, but affordable homeownership has not always been top of mind among our legislators and policymakers as needing attention.
And that changed. It's been like the missing piece of the puzzle in the past.
Partly, yeah. And that changed last year. And one example of that is the money that we were able to secure for down payment assistance that is still being planned and programmed, not yet available, but it's $100 million designed to help first generation buyers reach their goals of ownership. So as that program rolls out later this year, we'll be back to talk more about that. And that dollar amount was, as I said, really unprecedented. And the work that was actually started a couple of years ago with our work and the Home Coalition's work led to that success last year. And this year, we're continuing to build on that momentum with some pretty robust and active legislative agendas. And in the case of the work that we're doing in partnership with Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity, we're advocating for better regulation and more transparency around homeowner associations. Mm-hmm. In addition, we're also advocating for dollars that will support the construction of up to 1,000 units of affordable housing, including 150 affordable ownership units in St. Paul at the Heights development. Nice. So those are the priorities that we have with Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity. We're also an active member of the Home Coalition and fully support that agenda as well.
Very cool. So the Heights, I think, is it's a former golf course, right? And St. Paul, so a really large tract of land. Doesn't happen very often. And the city's being very planful about what they put there. And yeah, that sounds pretty unprecedented.
The city and the Port Authority are very involved in the development of that site, as is Sherman Associates. So
very cool. So I think you mentioned transparency around homeowner associations and that kind of stuff. That is interesting to me just because I've read so much about homeowners can be foreclosed on for money owed to an HOA. I did not know that. And those accounts can explode from a small fine, $50 or something. If you ignore it, it can go up to tens of thousands of dollars because they all correspond and work through law firms billed at standard rates. Seems very unfair and almost as if it's safer to miss your mortgage payment than your HOA dues payment, because at least there's some protections with that. And this is a problem nationwide. What do you think the prospects for this proposal are for this session?
So we've been working on the subject of homeowner associations for quite some time. And in fact, last year in the 2023 session, we did achieve some successes around consumer rights and notification to consumers about whatever fines they may have and the implications of those fines. Homeowner associations are an extremely important part of the construct of many many housing developments rely on associations for shared ownership of roads, infrastructure, exteriors of properties, etc. So homeowner associations are very important, and the number of them is growing.
Mm-hmm.
Our concern is that we don't have a lot of data about homeowner associations because there is no one place where associations have to identify themselves, register themselves, share information about themselves. And that's one thing that we would like to change.
Yeah.
In addition, we would like to create an office of an ombudsperson for homeowner associations so that when associations or homeowners have concerns about relationships in an association, they have a place to go to get information, to hear the true legalities of the situation that they might be facing, and get the information they need. We're spending a lot of time this year socializing these ideas.
Sure.
They're not likely to get passed this year, but we're getting a lot of support from our legislative partners, and we won't give up. We'll be back next year to talk about them too.
That's how we get started. That's how the first gen stuff got started. Very good. I'm glad we're pursuing that. Jeff, let's turn to you and the Homeownership Minnesota Coalition. And I should acknowledge what's perhaps obvious. The center is an active member of the coalition. What's top on the docket this year up at the Capitol? And also, I should ask you, give us some background on the Home Coalition and how it developed, where it came from.
Sure thing. It's been a bit of a journey. I'm one of the two co-chairs, myself and Kristen Inciti, who's the president of Habitat Minnesota, are co-chairs. From a structure perspective, we rotate the co-chairship. It's a 2-year term. And so I'm just fortunate to be able to be in that seat at this point in time. We'll rotate off at a future time. But really kind of how we got started, it goes back to my roots. One of my jobs right now is to serve as the administrator for the Minnesota CLT, or Community Land Trust Coalition. I know you've done a show on that. Yep. But going backward before that, I served as the director for the City of Lakes Community Land Trust. And way back in the early 2000s, we created a nonprofit, we being the community land trusts across the state, the 13 community land trusts, because we felt like we needed to do some peer-to-peer work. Right. We needed to educate one another, educate stakeholders about community land trust. It was just a very different space for community land trusts way back then when nobody knew about them. And as we kind of built some momentum, we also realized that a lot of legislators didn't know what community land trusts were. And so we said, let's start to do some policy and advocacy work. And really our initial work in those first years was just going out and explaining what a community land trust was. We had no policy ask. We had nothing that we were asking. We just wanted to build awareness. Right. After a few years, I think we thought we had some moxie, and we started to make some smaller asks as a coalition, only to really realize in the mid 2014, 2015 that we just didn't have enough political juice, even though we had members across the state, and we really realized that we needed to expand. It wouldn't be our umbrella, but really try to encourage other affordable home ownership providers across the state to be part of a coalition.
Because again, it's a piece of the puzzle.
It is, and we also realized that we needed more energy behind it, and so we reached out to several community development corporations. We reached out to the Homeownership Center, and the predecessor to the Home Coalition was this group called Workforce Homeownership Minnesota, or HOOM. And we did a little bit of work, and at that point in time, we then even realized that we needed to expand it outward. And so the current version of the Home Coalition includes pretty much every nonprofit affordable home ownership provider in the state.
That's great.
Includes Community Land Trust, it includes Habitat for Humanities. Any of the community action programs across the state that touch home ownership are part of this coalition. Yeah. Most of the community development corporations, manufactured housing. So, manufactured housing parks are part of our coalition. So it really has a broad base. And I think the thing that I really appreciated and have a ton of respect for in this coalition is that most of the folks that are members represent their organizations at the table are the executive directors. Yeah. And so when we talk to policymakers, they're coming to these conversations with some authority, and it's not that part of the reality is a lot of us don't have advocacy staff, right? We're smaller organizations, and so the reality is we need to show up if we're going to do this work. Right. But I think it also raises a bit of our credibility in those conversations, and the whole effort here, as Julie alluded to, was historically if you go back over the last 12, 14 years, out of the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency's kind of big funding round, which I call the Impact Fund, both multifamily rental and affordable home ownership organizations apply once a year. It's typically in the summer. Historically, over the last 12 years, about 5% of what they award every year, up until the last 2 years, had gone to affordable home ownership. So the other 95% went to really affordable rental, homelessness issues, and part of that number also included tax credit dollars from the federal government. So it's a much bigger number, but I think we were all struggling like we just need more resources going to affordable home ownership. So our push was trying to work on that, and the net of that, if you look back from 2012 to 2022. On average, about $10 million a year was going or being awarded through that funding round to affordable home ownership across the state. In 2022, about $20 million. So we made a 100% increase on what went to affordable home ownership. This last legislative session, which was huge, and for comparison's sake, this past December, $120 million went to affordable home ownership. So 6 times more than the previous year and 12 times more than the average of the previous 10 years, which is huge.
It sounds like they're getting the fact that it's a piece of the continuum and it has a role to play in solving everything from homelessness to wealth building. But yeah, I like that it's becoming less overlooked. So that's great. So I took a look at your legislative agenda this year. It's pretty technical. One thing that jumped out that I know that the Homeownership Center is also interested in is this whole, it's called contract for deed. And what we've seen out in the public is folks that think that they can't qualify for a regular mortgage, right? People that don't want to pay interest because of their religious beliefs, people without a social security number, without which you can't get a real one of these mortgages. A lot of times they turn to contract for deed as an option. And contract for deed as it stands right now has very little protections for consumers. And also, there are other options if you want, a home ownership loan without interest. There are programs. We have a guide for that on our website, Guide to Non-Interest Financing. There's ITIN mortgages for those without a social security number. That's individual taxpayer identification number. But my point here is contract for deed is kind of coming back fairly strongly these days. And we are pushing to get some consumer protections around that more than exist right now. What can we say about contract for deed? It sounds like this legislation is all about socialization, and I get that. Every other year it's the funding cycle. But Julie, maybe you want to talk more about the contract for deed issues.
Right. I think you hit on this, Bill. Contracts for deed are an important tool. In this case, we're talking about home ownership. Contracts for deed can be used for other mechanisms as well, but in this case, we're talking about home ownership. And they're typically a transaction between a seller investor and a buyer. And despite the fact that there can be some challenges with contracts for deed if they're not used properly, many of the consumers that we talk to speak to the importance of having contracts for deed. So part of the question that we asked when we started working with legal aid on the legislation this year is, should we just ban them altogether? And from consumers to real estate professionals to investors, they said, no, this is an important tool.
So there is a place for them.
There is a place for them. It just needs to be managed correctly. So the legislation this legislation is moving forward. We're seeing some great success under the leadership of legal aid and with the backing of the Home Coalition. We're implementing measures that would improve the communication that consumers receive when they purchase a contract for deed. So in other words, there will be better information about the cost of the contract for deed, whether there's a balloon payment involved, what the potential is for losing the home if you don't make your payment. The legislation will also extend the cancellation period. Contracts for deed do not go through the state's foreclosure process.
Right.
They go through a contract cancellation process. We're extending the length of that cancellation to give consumers more time to get their funding in place in an effort to save the property. There are measures in the legislation related to what's called churning. So if an owner purchases a property, sells on contract for deed, cancels it quickly, does it again, there are some measures that prevent that sort of turnaround
Abuse.
kind of behavior.
Right.
So we're very excited about what's moving forward with contracts for deed, and it's something we'll be talking about more once we get through the session. But we're moving it through committee, and we're very optimistic about it passing.
Good. I'll keep my eye on that for sure. Jeff, a couple other things jumped out in the Home Coalition's legislative agenda. Short-term rental tax, investor ownership efforts, the Metro sales tax efforts. You want to talk about any of that before we wrap up?
Absolutely. In addition to us being the Home Coalition, really trying to raise a profile and show the importance of affordable home ownership in the continuum of affordable housing. One of our principles, one of our values that has been a hard push, but I think really important to us and fundamental to our work is looking for dedicated sources of revenue, and especially dedicated sources of revenue where there's a nexus to housing and housing inaffordability as it relates to affordable home ownership. So you mentioned the vacation rental tax, Airbnb tax or VRBO tax. Currently in Minnesota, there isn't one. So one of the things that we're trying to move forward is an idea where any of the proceeds from that tax would go into an affordable home ownership fund to fund affordable home ownership production to counter what's happening. I think not only in Minnesota but across the United States. One of the things that's been long on our agenda has been the capture of the mortgage registry and deed tax. Every year, I mean, any transaction, there's a tax that goes toward the mortgage registry tax and the deed tax. Can we capture the incremental growth over time as it relates to the number of transactions and the growth in values of properties, taking that little bit every year that's incrementally more and putting that into a home ownership
What do
fund?
they use? What do those taxes go now?
Well, the mortgage registry and deed tax currently just go into the general fund to fund anything. What we're looking to do is just the year over year growth.
Right.
That $10 to $20 million a year that's going to be growing a little bit. Let's set aside a little bit of that so that we have a longer term source of funding for affordable home ownership. See, the reality for a lot of the members of Home is that we're small, nonprofit organizations, and it takes a lot of horsepower, energy, and money to go to the Capitol every year. And if we started to think about affordable home ownership, we started thinking about affordable housing for that matter as a basic need, as an infrastructure investment. We don't. A lot of infrastructure investments have dedicated sources of revenue in the state. And I think part of our push is to change the thinking so that there is a dedicated source of funding for affordable home ownership as well. We're losing the battle. It's only gotten worse. Right. And so the only way we're going to get ahead of it is to think about measures and strategies that get us ahead of the curve. Right.
Well, and it's something that's going to help everybody if you structure it that way, which is what I like about it. Super interesting stuff. I'm a little surprised at how active we are as the Homeownership Center, as being a partner in some of these efforts. Your Home Coalition, so great. Goodness, I think I'll wrap up on that note. So that's it for this episode. If you are interested in exploring homeownership for your own household, you can take a home buying class and enlist the help of a homeownership advisor for free by going to hocmn.org. Our advisors and educators are embedded in organizations across the state, and they'll work with you to help get you mortgage ready, educate you on the buying process from A to Z, and walk with you through every step of the process. I want to thank our guests today, Julie Gugin and Jeff Washburne. Great discussion. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Bill.
In closing, I want to acknowledge our sponsors. We have Associated Bank, Bell Bank, Bremer Bank, Huntington Bank, Midwest One Bank, and Old National Bank. Our sincere thanks to each of these organizations for their support. And that is it. Thanks for watching and listening.